This talk and the JavaScript for WordPress conference are brought to you by our sponsors at 10up and WP Buffs. 10up makes a better web with finely crafted websites and tools for content creators. Check out their junior and senior dev positions at 10up.com/careers. WP Buffs provides 24/7 fully managed support and white label agency services. Find out how they can help you focus on what you do best at wpbuffs.com/partnerships.
So let's get started here. I changed the name of my topic because if you watch the video where Zach and I previewed this at the time a few months ago, we had no idea what this was going to be about because we hadn't figured out yet. Anybody hadn't exactly figured out how WordPress state management in and around Redux and WordPress React was going to work. So this is kind of my theory based on stuff that we're working on for Caldera Forms. So why state management? Right, this is a common pattern that we see in modern application architecture today. But we don't want to solve problems because on the internet it said follow this pattern. Like, don't just do things. It says it on the internet. Okay, well, if it's on my website and it's like marketing or documentation, like do that, buy the thing, use the thing. But in general, don't do what they just say on the internet unless it solves a problem. So these are the big problems that I think that happen in applications that state management can help solve. These aren't things it does. These are things that benefits that we get from it. Helps with performance and DOM rendering. Does increase the code quality. And I say that both abstractly and it also makes it easier to keep things tested and maintained so that way we can, analyze our code and see its quality and see its testing. And so the developer experience of working with state management and front-end development, everything else at this point for me, I feel like is a bad developer experience. So those are the benefits that we really get. As has been said, I'm Josh. You can find me on the internet. One thing that you should find are my slides. There's a lot of code examples here. I'm not really sure the best way to present them, so I made a post. This is going to redirect you over to our site because WordPress, that's where it's going to go from Caldera Forms to JoshPress because we didn't have Gutenberg installed yet. And I need Gutenberg to kind of lay things out the way that you'll see there. So I recommend following along. That way you'll be able to see the code. And I wanted this to be something practical. This is based on something that I'm working on right now. So I wanted you to be able to click into GitHub and see, I've cut out little chunks of code, see where it lives in reality. So what does state management do, right? Do you really need this? Is this going to do something beneficial for you? And so what it does is it gets us away from this. This is what we kind of traditionally had PHP, JavaScript applications where we're using PHP to render an HTML template and then jQuery or something makes it, dynamic. And so this is kind of the old way. I still maintain a lot of code that looks kind of like this, right? That we we print out a form input and then, when it's submitted, we do something. When it changes, we do something. We use jQuery.on a lot. And that works. There's no single source of truth for state. And that it by itself isn't a problem, but it gets creepy into other problems. Because we don't know if how to have one thing that happens every time this changes. We can subscribe to a change, but how do we do things after something else changes, right? There's not one place. We'll talk more about one thing, one change. It's totally reliant on the DOM, makes testing weird, slow, right? DOM manipulation is the slowest thing we can do in front-end development, and something that React and Vue abstract out, and state management makes sane. So that's great. Cross-browser issues, right? This is more of like a general pitch for React Vue, but right then we get state management with Redux or Vuex or whatever. And then when you work with the DOM directly for your state, because that becomes the default source of truth, what's the input's value? Tests are hard, isolation's hard, reproducibility, reusability, it's all very hard. So let's make it easier. Let's develop faster. Let's make our tests easier. Let's just not mess with the old stuff, right? So one of the key things that we use when we employ Redux, and a lot of other things in React around it, is that we employ pure functions. Pure functions have no side effects. Something goes in, something predictable comes out. It's often to use this term pure function a lot. So very simple functions that don't modify global state, they don't call other things, they just have input and output. Very easy to test. We'll advance slide. So these are my points. I got ahead. Easy to refactor, it just does one thing, right? It sticks to one responsibility. It can only return that one thing. So there's one responsibility, one reason to change when we use pure function. So this leads us to the single responsibility principle. Everything has one job. I like this one, this being you had one job where the little tab's on the wrong side. And what's great about this is that, let's say that the factory is constructed in a way there's one machine that drops that little tab over the opening. If this is happening, I know exactly one thing that needs fixed in that factory, right? And then if our factory is the design pattern for factory that we're now talking about, if there's a problem with what's coming out of the factory, we have one place to change. We're out of state management. So this is a screenshot. Actually, this is Vuex, which is Vue's state management. And what I'm showing here is that we had an issue where the API keys for Counterforms Pro weren't coming out correctly from state, or they weren't being injected into the component properly. And I thought the problem was like type checking, so I changed it in one place. And I thought about taking the slide out when I realized that this was the total wrong approach and caused more problems than it was worth. It didn't fix my problem. But I left it in because obviously I just reverted those two lines. I didn't have to wander all over the application looking for all the places where I implemented this type check. I did it once where it comes out of state. That's the only place where it should change. These functions have that sole responsibility. And so Uncle Bob says that we only have one reason to change. Any module, anything. These are linked in my slides deck, or in the post about it. But the single responsibility, it's about change. We say it's about doing one thing. It's really about only having one reason to change. In here, Tom's talking about PHP classes having one reason to change. Same concept. If this class was to change, what would need to be changed? Applies here. These functions should only have one reason that answers that function changes. So states management is this overreaching pattern that has this large responsibility of managing state, and then these little things inside of it take on parts of it. So good encapsulation. State flows down naturally. Learning React or Vue, I find to be very simple at first because you just kind of put stuff in and it renders and it's beautiful. And then you have to get the data back up. And that's the hard part. You pass from components properties, can pass to their children, can pass to their children. Very nice. Getting it back up to where state lives is very hard. And then if state belongs to different components, then that becomes a spaghetti mess. So we're trying to deal with that problem of getting it all into the right place when it changes. So we can, in React or Vue or other systems, you can have local state. And that's useful to an extent. If you have a simple application, it could just have one component that owns the state, and that's enough. In Vue, there is a pattern of using a global event bus that's injected into everything, and then you can dispatch events like updates of state onto them. So that's cool. We actually use that at the Counterforms Pro web app, which is a Vue app. Good, not great. And then you have specialized systems, Vuex in the Vue ecosystem, Redux in the React ecosystem. You can use Redux in Vue, use Flexible. And other projects have that. I know Vue and React. So Redux is, in general, the standard for state management in React. It is used in WordPress Gutenberg, which we'll talk with in a bit. So there is this WordPress Data module that we're talking about here, and it's a super useful Redux extraction. Redux does a lot, but you end up using a bunch of helper libraries, There's a bunch of conventions that make it manageable and testable. And so this is something that you would probably build something like this to put together the whole system anyway. This comes for free. It's already loaded in WordPress, and you can use it outside of WordPress. That's why this talk is called In and Around WordPress. Because I'm talking about building a user interface for WordPress-related stuff, if that makes sense. So WordPress admin screens, Gutenberg blocks, React component applications that might be deployed outside of the WordPress environment or not. And if you understand Webpack, and if you didn't, like back up to Julian's talk, you'll know that we can kind of build once and get this working. WordPress Data is one of the many modules that are coming out of Gutenberg. Great idea that this pattern of things get developed in Gutenberg that are useful for WordPress plugins and core development, like say Gutenberg, get put up to NPM modules. And so you do NPM install WordPress Data, and you have WordPress Data module now in your application. So if you're building a WordPress plugin, you can make it a dev dependency so you can test with it, but not include it in your builds. If you're doing like a WordPress plugin admin screen, or if you have a React app, you can make it a regular dependency, and then the fact that WordPress isn't a thing in your environment doesn't matter. A lot of cool stuff going on. Watch this. Like to search for at WordPress on NPM. There's a lot of cool stuff happening up there. So what about Context API? I don't know. I read the blog post. This is the new Shiny. It's an alternative way of injecting state into React. Take a look at it, see how it matures. I don't know. If you have a good test, you can switch later. We'll talk about the decoupling. But right now, Redux is great. So let's walk through kind of wiring up this state management into a React app using Redux and WordPress. So this separation of responsibilities means that state is managed by Redux. That's its job. Injecting state into UI belongs to a container component or components, depending on how complex your application is. And then you display UI with this externally managed state using presentational components. This pattern's sort of really well defined in Dan Abramov's post presentational container components. Click on there in the in my post. There's a link, and read this. Just read it before you mess with Redux. You're going to have to read it at some point because he defines the pattern other people are following really well. And so container components are responsible for this bridge between state and the user interface. Presentational components, that UI is managed elsewhere. So container components manage that bridge, and then presentation components are a type of component, and everything inside of them are these dumb components. Wherein when we say dumb, we mean that it doesn't know anything. It doesn't know how to update state. It doesn't know state. It just gets state. So this is, most of the example code is working here is based on the Caldera processors library that I'm working on. Just an abstract set of user interface for the next generation Caldera Forms processors, UI. But it's built decoupled in. So this is the main component here. You can see it extends React Pure component, so it doesn't manage its own state, basically. Read about that. It's a subtle difference. This is basically like using a function for your component, which I generally do besides these. Because you don't need to manage state. That's the great thing of React.component, manage the state. Don't need it. And you'll notice these props are just like that this.props.on update processor. That's passing in what do you do when the processor updates. And you also see this is just kind of wrapping individual small components because, right, that's the way, with the React way, is that you have these little encapsulated, reusable, decoupled components. And then one of the things that's going to help when we start gluing this all together is prop types. I am not using a Flow or TypeScript or anything like that. Well, a little bit of Flow, but not in these examples. And it is important that you have your types, because it shows you how to use the components. It forces them to be used right. And if you make a change where all of a sudden a grandchild component gets the wrong props, your test fail because of this. So I really like the props library. You don't have to use TypeScript or Flow, which sometimes is worth it, sometimes isn't, but you still get those benefits. So if you make a change and it's about to break, something weird you weren't thinking about, your test failed. Solved. Well, you solved it. So these are my default props. And again, this has nothing to do with state management. And that's exactly the point, is that the application user interface layer isn't tied at all. So we can move it to a different system. We can inject mock data for tests. We can say, oh, I just need that one thing. Let me rip it out and make it into its own package, and it's wire up different state. So that's great. And again, this is dumb because it doesn't know what is happening above it. This just takes input and creates output. It is a pure component, like we were talking about pure functions before. And then this is a small component that gets put into the app. It's also a dumb component. It's literally just a button that has a click handler and a label. It doesn't find the label, it supplied the label. And the only thing that it does when it's clicked is it formats the output, right? So event.target.value is whatever the value was. So we just don't get the event object. I don't need that above. So that's kind of passing state back up, which, as I said, is the hard part. These are dumb in the sense that they don't care where it's coming from, where it's been updated. They just pass data through. Test coverage. I keep going back to this, jest and enzyme. Once you get the hang of them, they're very well documented. Jest is a test runner that has basic assertions built in. It's using Mocha or Chai or whatever. And so you can do snapshot testing, make sure your prop types are being passed correctly. And then enzyme lets you render a fake DOM essentially for your components and do things like, hey, when I render this with a class name prop of HiRoy, does it come out with the HiRoy class? Those sort of things. And so this was for that new processor component. This first test, you see describing processor add button, describe renders with default label, right? So these are very readable. This is 2 nested tests. So describe render with default label, right? We have 2 tests in here. It matches snapshot. So I'm just passing the basic props there and just making sure it's the same as last time it ran. Did anything weird happen? Are my nested prop type validation going to cause an error? Nope, good. Doesn't have the default label, right? In this case, I'm just checking that if I don't pass it the label prop, it has whatever my default value is. I'm just checking wrapper.txt. That's the inner HTML. And this is cut down. You can see the whole thing, but it does things like, does it render the custom message, right? Does it do X, Y, and Z? So that kind of stuff. Does it dispatch the event handler for the change? So that was a lot about dumb components that just render state, which is totally the opposite of the topic, but I wanted to point out that this is the goal, that we are trying to have these components have the sole responsibility of rendering UI and let everything else about state that they get happen in state. Again, state flows down naturally, and that includes the functions to update state. We just saw that where we're passing down props.on, update, whatever. Those are just functions that get called. They're pure functions generally. And you just call those in the components. And if what happens after they're called changes, that's the responsibility of state management, and we'll change there. And we'll get there in 1 second. So state is just totally decoupled from view. And state can be managed by anything as far as those dumb components are. No, they're ignorant of it. They do not know how state is managed. So we can now connect state to those by this concept we say wrapping in state. Let's unpack that in a second. Actions, selectors, resolvers, stores. These are kind of the concepts I'm about to walk through as we formalize this system of actions are what you take to update it. Selectors are what you take to get the data. Resolvers are a concept that gives us the ability to have asynchronous actions we'll get to. And then stores sort of pulls it all together. You use Register Store and Gutenberg. So when we talked about, and then this other key thing to making this work is these higher order components. These are really well explained in the React docs. There's a link in my post for my slides. They wrap, I keep using this metaphor, a component with additional logic. They tend to control uncontrolled components, right? So this component is dumb, it's uncontrolled. It doesn't know what's going on, and then they control it. They give it its state. So they keep the concerns separate. They have the logic of state, or API, or in Gutenberg, there's the with spoken messages component. So that way, if you want to have an input that gives accessibility screen messages, you don't build that into your component. You build the component, the inform input, and you wrap it in the higher order component that adds these additional functions. And then you test the two separately and can use the two separately or together. So all of our concerns are separated. Higher order components, they're tricky and weird. A component transforms props into UI. Higher order component transforms a component into another component. It's a little weird, but let's see it in action. This is the with API data higher order component in Gutenberg. And what this does is at the top, we have a pure component that expects a post, and it's dumb to what a post is, just needs to have the shape of a WordPress REST API post as an object as it would be returned. But then we wrap, and you can see at the very last line there, this iffy is passing the my post, but it's modifying it with this with API data that will get the post from this endpoint wp/v2/post/post ID, right? So we can pass post ID, post type, which is optional in this example, the default post, and then it just kind of works from there. But we could mock this component on the top, my post, with our tests. We could reuse it with state managed in Redux instead of directly with WP API data. Doesn't matter. The provider HOC. I am in this example using React Redux. I think I can pull it from WordPress. I just haven't looked. React Redux is the React implementation of Redux. Redux is not totally tied to React. You can use it with whatever. There are Vue adapters for it. But so when you use it, you require React Redux and React Redux. And so this provider HOC is wrapping this Caldera processors with state, which we'll get to in a second, component, which is wrapping Caldera processors, which we saw already. And it's injecting this store. And that store is imported here, but it's using WordPress Data Register Store, which is documented on the NPM page and in the Gutenberg source. So there are other providers that do something similar. The React router has a provider that wraps your whole thing in the route. So you have all your different routes, and it figures out, based on general connection to Redux, which one to actually show right now. Context API has a provider for its implementation. So again, maybe we're all going to be using context in 2 years. Similar concepts. And having Redux now and having it very well tested may allow you just to switch providers, switch a few things. And then as a totally different example, WordPress Rich Text Provider is one that helps inject some of the different settings, global settings in Gutenberg for the rich text editor. So that way the rich text editor can be developed decoupled from the rich text settings that you want as a global thing in the editor, but you don't want that global state strongly tied to the component. So good use of higher order components. WordPress Data ships with a bunch of helpful higher order components. The with select higher order component adds the ability to select the data, which, as I said, is you get data from the store with selector. This is a common pattern. Reselect implements this. I don't know what if WordPress is using that under the hood or not, but WordPress has this convention of selectors. Very neat to talk about. If you want them to be injected into your done components, you wrap them in the with state HOC. This is very much like map state to props. If you're familiar with Redux, as it's typically used Redux, use map state to props to do this. Same basic thing. Greg from Automatic DM me how to mimic this. The way that you do that generally in Redux, I tried it. I prefer just to do it the way that I'm showing now. Your call. I can share that later. Because this is this Caldera processors with state. If I go back a few here, you'll see this was my provider HOC is wrapping Caldera processors with state. And then in this example, React DOM is just rendering it. But I would put the same thing into my test, with the test render. So this is wrapping it with select. These are my selector functions here that I'm wrapping in this select function that WordPress provides to me. And it lets me go from this store that I've registered. I'm working kind of backwards here. And say, I need the get processors collection. I need the get processors types. And then these are props that are available in my components. So these are just making these props applied to the Caldera processors component, which you can see at the bottom is what's being wrapped here. And that's a DOM component that expects these properties, as well as these are the ones for reading, not the ones for updating. We'll get to those right now with dispatch HOC, with selects data. In Vuex, we call those, instead of selectors, we call them getters, which I think is a better name. It's just, what does it do? It gets data. Getters, setters, right? So think about selectors as getters and dispatchers as setters. I like that. Makes sense to me. So this is the with dispatch HOC. Again, this is implementing what's done in React Redux as map updates to prop, map dispatch to prop, sorry. And so this is, again, in this case, I am getting rid of the with select HOC. We'll be back. And wrapping in the with dispatch. So this provides these updaters, right? You see, I'm creating these versions of my action functions, and I'll show you my decoupled action functions with dispatch. So that way, however WordPress has set up Redux works, that these go into my store, not somebody else's store, the one defined in that slug that you see there. Inside the first expression inside of the closure. And so this, and again, this is why I put on my blog post everything there, because it gets hard to read. I'm really trying to come up with the most useful and accessible solution for code examples. Hence why I'm kind of throwing things around in Gutenberg, because it makes it possible. Yeah, so this is the whole thing. You see, we're wrapping it at the very bottom, Caldera processors. We're wrapping it with select and with dispatch. Sometimes we don't need to update, so we just wrap in with select. Sometimes we need both, so we wrap it in both. And again, this could be simplified a little bit. I think this is a little bit more verbose and makes it obvious what's going on here. And so this is all of my selectors, all my dispatchers. And so this component is actually a pure function, sort of, kind of. It's not dumb. It's aware state, but it's getting all of that from above. But it's wrapping this thing that's totally decoupled. If we want to rip Redux out of this, done, not a problem. So I've been talking about actions. Actions update state. We call them mutations in Vuex, which I think, again, is a better word, or we can call them setters. So we dispatch these actions. These are things that we dispatch. They're synchronous, and they have they help. I should have put the word help here. They help mutate data. That happens inside of the reducer, which we'll get to in a second. They form the shape of what's going to be updated. Hard to talk about actions and reducers apart. So this is a action function from the library that I'm demoing. And this creates this consistent shape, which we then write a test for this action that we're going to dispatch every time we want to add a new processor. We give it a unique slug here, and I put that in a constant so that way I don't have to remember how to type that string every time, and I have one thing that changes if a change needs to be made of the name of the thing. And then this is just a function, pure function. So I can test it. I have some mock data here, just that it would expect. And then add processor action creator creates the right type of action. So I'm just checking that action.type is exactly what you would expect it to be, add processor, right? I must have, if you look at it on GitHub, I must have imported that constant that was exported in the last slide. And then add processor action creator creates the right payload. Test one thing. Test should, as much as possible, have one assertion. So these are two tests in the same suite to test each of the properties. What comes in comes out. Very simple test. Almost seems weird, right? Like what comes in goes out. Yes, but if anything about this changes, we want to know. So having this basic test in place, any test that changes that we didn't expect happen as we refactor. Selectors, again, are kind of like getters. They get data from state. That's their sole responsibility. Again, this isn't exactly a Redux thing. It's a Redux.js/reselect is the official implementation of this pattern. And WordPress.data/data does. So we're talking about WordPress.data today. It's common. And so here's a selector function. In this case, processors is if state is a map. Map is a data type, kind of like it's an array that knows keys. So it's kind of like string identifier for keys. So it's like a indexed array in PHP. It's a great structure for this because we can do things like state.has, return state.get, or return null. And what's cool there is maybe null was the wrong thing to return, one thing to change. And so that's my function, again, a pure function. State can be easily mocked. I can pass any map into there. In fact, here we do. Here's my mock state. Processor and form, they're the same thing as you saw in the last function. Last example test. And basically what we're expecting is if I call that with mock state, do I get exactly what I expected? Again, very simple. If it breaks, everything's bad. So test it just to make sure. Because that's a key place where data flows through. So reducers. Reducers are the one thing I've been talking around, but are really at the center of Redux. These are pure functions that mutate state. So reducers are a concept. They're a type of function that takes a collection and outputs one thing. So a common example would be counts everything or reduces, an array to a simpler array. There is an array.reduce method in JavaScript, useful in this, but not always. And so we must return a new state object. We do not want to mutate the state object. You're going to have trouble where you're like, my tests look right, but it's not in the UI, it's not updating. Yeah, that's because you modified the reference to the object that React has. And it doesn't update. That's just literally not how it works, right? This is why like Vuex's data for component scope returns an array, has to return a function. So it creates new objects. That's just not how React works. So we use the spread operator a lot because like reducers must return a new object, and this is going to confuse you and you're going to get it wrong. I'm sorry, beginner's mind, just roll with it. So if you look here, I'm actually getting around this with a clone function where it's clone it every time in this case. For sometimes in other cases, I am using state.set, which does actually create a new version. Well, depending if you return it into an object with spread. If you look in the source, you actually see where I'm using spread operator more. Spread operator in ES6, ESNext syntax is great because you can create new objects from parts of other objects and then just add the one thing that's changed. And so that solves so many problems using spread operator on arrays and objects. Because if you say use array.push to push new data in, you've mutated the reference that React has and it doesn't care. Just will not update. That's not how it works. Don't force it. Create a new object. So don't fight it. So this is my reducer for my test. In this case, I'm just kind of testing that it'll return a map because that's the state, that's the form of the state. If that changes, that's a major change. But you do things like you dispatch an action, go to the link that I have there, and see, you dispatch an action into it. You literally just pass the action. It's the second function. It's the second function, action, and you see this is the switch, action.type, which is why we wanted that consistent action generator, because here we're making some assumptions about what our action functions are, but we can trust those if we always use our action functions, and our action functions are tested to have that form. We know that this is new processor and that it has certain things, action.processor, associated with it, because we've tested for it. So that's all synchronous. That's, you have the data in the screen. You know, it's local to what's happening. But oftentimes we need to like get stuff out of the the cloud or whatever with an AJAX call, and we can do that with resolvers. In general, higher level than I'm going to go in Redux, you have to use middlewares to be asynchronous. Setting that up is kind of pain, so like WordPress abstracted that out with resolvers. And so basically it's this idea that you have one, I think my next screenshot shows this. Right, so this is actually from Caldera Forms' Gutenberg block. I wanted to kind of come into Gutenberg here. But this is selectors. I kind of cut this down. We have one called getForm. And the second argument is form ID, right? So state always gets passed, but when we call it, we only pass form ID. So if I pass form ID CF1234 to getForm, the first time it's going to call this resolver, which is calling an asynchronous function from our API client, and then dispatching this set form action. Then the next time I call it, it uses the selector getForm. But if I call it with a different ID for broad value for form ID, then it calls the resolver. If I call it with the same one, it calls the selector again. Cool? So this is a great way, as I said here, to lazy load state, right? Look it up. You don't have it, get it, look it up. You have it, just use it locally. And this is also great for if like you had a get post that took a page parameter. You could implement lazy loading or like dynamic scrolling where you only showed 10. So that way it would load 10, you'd scroll down, it would 11 through 20. Scroll up, it would just refresh from state 1 through 10. Scroll down twice, it's going to have to go and get 21 through 30. But the actual, you never call a resolver directly, you always just call the selector, and like magic happens behind. Testing. I test that they're defined in the store, that the store has the resolvers, that they're like functions, right? I just took the type of, and what I'm showing here is actually a test that the form client, which is a decoupled NPM module now for us, we're kind of moving like Gutenberg is to, Caldera JS modules all over the place that we can use in different places, because we do a web app that's a Laravel app with a JavaScript single page front end and a WordPress plugin that uses React and Vue for now, and a Gutenberg block. That kind of. So we have an API client, and so we're just testing in this case that it like works in this context. And this is actually from the test case for that. So that's covered on itself, and so just test that like your store has this function. Test its actual functionality where it belongs. So I keep talking about WordPress stores, but I didn't want to talk about them without what goes into them, because it wouldn't make sense. And so it's this abstraction over Redux powered by WordPress Data. You probably build something like this anyway, and it's on the page when you go into Gutenberg. So don't develop for two things, right? Just use it. That solves problems that you're going to have whether you're in WordPress or not. Makes it easier to decide later, oh, this thing I built for my web app needs to go in Gutenberg. Or this thing for Gutenberg needs to live in this place where Gutenberg normally isn't loaded. But the WordPress Data module, I can say WP script, whatever my script dependencies, WP-data, I think, whatever, it's documented. But I can just say, hey, when we're WordPress, supply it outside, make it part of my production. Use it in any React app. This is the outline. This is from that processors library. I have 2 reducers. I wanted to point this out that there's no reason why you have to have 1 reducer in your application other than it's easy and simple, but right, 1 responsibility. In this case, the registration of custom processors, that needs its own state management. We need a single source of truth for all those definitions. That's different than the current settings of the processors for this form. So those are 2 different reducers with different responsibilities. WordPress Data exports reducers, so does React Redux. This allows you to combine multiple reducers, very scalable. A mistake I've made that I would recommend avoiding is not using this no matter what. Right? I had to, if you look at the Git history of this library, I didn't use it originally, and then when I realized I needed 2, possibly 3 reducers, and I was going to need more containers as I went, I had to switch to combine reducers. I had to do some refactoring. Luckily, I had good test coverage, but I would recommend, even if you have 1, just assume you'll have multiple, and use combined reducers, so that way you don't have to refactor your first reducer. But you see here, I have actions, it's just an array. I'm sorry, an object, selectors, just an object, resolvers, just an object. This is really well documented on the README page for it. How to plug this all in, we've already looked at this. And this is actually what it looks like in Caldera forms for our block, where we're importing from our state the reducer for forms. And I'm wrapping that in a function, so that way it's this. This is the one reducer that it's mapping. Creates its own scope there in this closure. And then actions, those are my action functions that get reused in different places, my selector functions, and right now we only have 1 resolver, so we just developed it in line. And then you pass this to register store, and then, there should be a slide for that. Sorry, it's documented. Look at how to register a store, it's super easy. You pass the name of the store and then an array of an object of options, like that one. And then we can actually use this in the examples that I've been showing. I was wrapping kind of the whole state in an application in a component and then passing that down. The other way to do it is to have a component and then wrap it in the higher order component, just like we do with our app. And this is something that we do with the form chooser inside of Gutenberg. Because we can select from this registered store, I can have the select control. It's using the WordPress components select control. That's actually that import works inside of WordPress there, constant select control equals, but I could use Webpack because components is now on NPM. This is just older than that. And so, but at the bottom, I'm using this higher order component with select to select the get form, right? This get form selector function must select forms. And then you can see again, this thing's dumb. It doesn't know what to do other than I just pass the new value to props.onChange. You pass me value, you pass me options, I render it. That's what this select control does. But then it gets wrapped in state with the higher order component. 2 things, different responsibilities. Same pattern we've been talking about forever. This is a repeat slide. If you want to use WordPress Data Store in React, do. It's just, there's nothing fancy here. Right? Data flows down. This is kind of wrapping up here, I think. Redux at the top, container, which manages that interaction between Redux and React, the UI. And again, React could be anything. Could be a view. Could be your own thing. And then we have these presentation components that only know what's given to them. And they kind of lay out all of our little components that have the actual individual broken down components. And I'm like cheekily using spread operator for an unknown number of components that are nested underneath. Also, you can have multiple containers. Just data flows down. And then you pass change handlers down so that way they can get state back up, but they're just props. So with our prop types, we say on new processor, we saw this component earlier. This is its prop types. Prop types .func .is required. So you must pass a function to this or error. And then label, I think, has a default value, but it can be a string, so it's not required. Again, I talked about prop types earlier. You just have to do this, or it's conventions. And conventions don't scale. They either can't be refactored. You get afraid to touch things. You lose the benefits of like writing functions. So don't pass state too far down. I make this mistake all the time where I just I have like 7 layers and then it gets spaghetti. No matter what you do, how many tests you have, it's spaghetti. And things become strongly coupled to their like 4 generations back ancestor that's passing props. So great grandchild component pattern, maybe not as good as implementing multiple containers with multiple reducers, combining them with the combine reducer function. Test everything. It's so simple. Like PHP unit's cool. I use it. I spend so much time setting a PHP unit and WordPress test suite. Like just so easy. And you just keep refactoring, knowing that you have that coverage. So you just got to keep those types consistent for that approach. Again, I made it very clear. I love prop types. I do not know TypeScript. I have one part of our system that we're doing there. I felt like Flow was needed. I might be wrong, right? It's a static type checking system. Allows you to annotate your code so that, just like in PHP 7, we have type decorations. It's that implementation for JavaScript. It really helps with this sort of thing where you need to make sure that your props are a string or a function or whatever. So maybe Flow or TypeScript solves that problem for you. Maybe prop types do one, or this just gets weird and doesn't scale. That's the end. I'm assuming I'm beyond time. Oh, I'm right on time. I want points for that. I started 5 minutes late and ended 1 minute early. That is a Gutenberg webhook because I didn't say Gutenberg enough. And our cat Dara mascot there on the site. According to that little bubble down there, there are 350 people watching. That's insane. Thank you.
Yeah.
That means a ton to me. Get my slides at that link. Get in touch there and read through the example code. Let me know what you think. Open issues where I'm wrong. Thank you again. This is great. Thanks, Zach, for having me.
Thanks for watching this talk from the JavaScript for WordPress conference. If you're interested in more talks like this, head over to javascriptforwp.com/conference to see an archive of all talks, as well as information about upcoming events.